If you grew up on a British farm, a David Brown was most likely the tractor you learned to drive on. White and chocolate tinwork, a gearbox that never gave trouble, built to last a lifetime. And for most families, it did. At its peak, the David Brown works at Meltham employed nearly 4,000 people in a single Pennine Valley, exporting tractors to 100 countries. They survived the war, survived the oil crisis, survived foreign competition that wiped out half the industry. They kept the gates open through everything the 20th century threw at them. And then, after 49 years of tractor making in that valley, the works fell silent. How does a factory whose best-selling machine was the most popular tractor in its parent company's entire global range simply close? What really happened at Meltham? Chapter 1. DB. Every Aston Martin ever built carries 2 letters on its badge. DB. Most people assume it's a model designation, a code like GT or RS, something dreamt up in a marketing office. It isn't. Those 2 letters are a man's initials. David Brown. And David Brown wasn't a racing driver, wasn't a car designer, wasn't a playboy with a checkbook and a fantasy. He was a tractor maker, a Yorkshireman from Huddersfield who built gears and ploughed fields and happened, almost by accident, to buy a struggling sports car company for £20,000 in 1947. When Sean Connery accelerated a DB5 through a Swiss mountain pass in Goldfinger, the most famous car chase in cinema history, those initials on the bonnet belonged to a man whose day job was running a tractor, works on a hillside in the Pennines. The same engineering team, in the same West Yorkshire valley, cast engine blocks for British farmers' diesels and machined components for James Bond's car. 3 doors apart, on the same factory floor. The works was at Meltham Mills, a village of 7,500 souls tucked into a valley below Wessendon Moor, 4.5 miles southwest of Huddersfield. At its peak, the David Brown tractor works occupied 78 acres of that valley and employed nearly 4,000 people, more than half the working-age population of the village itself. They built tractors that went to 100 countries. They won the Queen's Award for Export Achievement, twice. They were Britain's 3rd largest tractor manufacturer, behind only Ford and Massey Ferguson, and their white and chocolate machines were as much a part of the British farming landscape as dry stone walls and border collies. That was 1971. By 1988, it was over. The David Brown name had been stripped from every bonnet. The workforce had been cut from 4,000 to nothing. The last tractor, a red and black Case International, badged with someone else's name, rolled off the line on the 11th of March, 1988, and was shipped to a warehouse in Wisconsin. An auctioneer sold off 800 machine tools in a single weekend, and the most modern tractor assembly line in Britain became a carpet yarn spinning shed. The DB initials survived, of course. They're still on every Aston Martin built today, the DB12 carrying them into 2026 as if nothing happened. But the works that earned those letters, the community that built the tractors that paid for the sports cars, the valley where 4,000 men and women clocked in every morning at 7:30, that's gone, replaced by small industrial units, a self-storage facility, and a cafe called Lou's Place. This is how it happened. Chapter 2. The Pattern Maker's Grandson. The story begins, as so many Yorkshire industrial stories do, with a young man and a stable. In 1860, a 17-year-old pattern maker named David Brown set up his first workshop in his landlord's stable on East Parade, Huddersfield. Thomas Broadbent ran the local foundry and rented him the space. The boy carved wooden patterns for casting, the moulds from which gears and machine parts were made. He had no capital. He had no employees. He had a skill and a valley full of textile mills that needed parts. 13 years of saving brought him 2 employees and his own premises at Chapel Hill. By 1898, the pattern maker had become a gear cutter. He imported a German cutting machine for £500, the equivalent of roughly 69,000 today, and began producing machine-cut gears. In 1902, he moved to a 12-acre site at Lockwood called Park Works, where the David Brown gear business still operates in 2026. He died the following year. He was 60. His sons, Frank and Percy, took over. During the First World War, Admiralty contracts swelled the payroll from 200 to 1,000. By 1921, David Brown and Sons was the world's largest manufacturer of worm gears, a claim backed by a royal warrant in 1922. Percy died in 1931. Frank became chairman. Frank's son, David Brown II, had been watching since boyhood. Born in 1904 at Park Cottage, a house that stood literally inside the 17-acre Park Works site, he'd grown up with the sound of gear cutting in his ears. His father quizzed him on the company mailbox every Sunday throughout his schooling. At 17, he was apprenticed in the family firm, cycling 6 miles to clock in by 7:30 every morning. No favours, no shortcuts. He was promoted to managing director at 27. The man who emerged from that apprenticeship was charming, obstinate, restless, and sharp-eyed. He raced motorcycles, played polo at Ham Polo Club, qualified as a pilot. He married 3 times. He mixed easily with men on the shop floor, but kept absolute managerial control until the day it was wrestled from him. Years later, when he owned Aston Martin, he was famous for using a Jaguar XJ as his daily car because it was cheaper to run, a piece of Yorkshire frugality that became legend in the motor industry. But David Brown's first great leap had nothing to do with cars. It had to do with a temperamental Irishman, a handshake, and a secret drawing office on the top floor. In 1936, Harry Ferguson, the Belfast inventor who designed the world's first production tractor with hydraulic lift and 3-point linkage, placed an inquiry for an engineering partner to build his prototype. David Brown answered it. They formed the Ferguson-Brown Company on a handshake. No formal contract. Production of the Ferguson-Brown Model A began at Park Gear Works, then moved to a disused thread mill at Meltham that Brown had acquired in 1939. The old United Thread Mills complex, formerly belonging to Jonas Brook and Brothers. 1,356 Ferguson-Brown tractors were built. 400 were exported to Norway. But Ferguson was brilliant and volatile, and sales were sluggish because farmers had to buy proprietary Ferguson implements alongside the machine. When Brown modified the design without consulting Ferguson, adding a combined PTO and belt pulley, the Irishman was furious. He'd been in America. He hadn't been asked. Brown wasn't waiting. He'd already engaged a designer named Albert Kersey, secreted away in an isolated drawing office on the top floor of Park Works. The project was codenamed VAC-1, Vehicle Agricultural Kerosene No. 1. Leonard Craven, a young apprentice at the time, remembered the cloak and dagger activity on the top floor, a no-go area for everyone except the small team of David Brown engineers, who were examining in detail every tractor made by every competitor they could find. The VAK-1 was unveiled at the 1939 Royal Show in Windsor Great Park. Ferguson terminated the partnership on his return from America and went back across the Atlantic to make his famous handshake deal with Henry Ford, the one that gave the world the little grey Fergie. David Brown kept the factory, he kept the workforce, and he kept something else. The VAK-1 needed a colour, needed a... Brown sent for his red hunting jacket, threw it across the bonnet of the prototype, and told the factory painters, Harold Hawks and Harry Lockley, to match it. They did. Hunting Pink was born, the current red livery that would define David Brown tractors for 26 years, chosen on the spot by a Yorkshireman reaching for the nearest thing in his wardrobe. War was coming, and Meltham was about to discover what it could build. Chapter 3. Cropmaster. The Second World War turned David Brown's gearworks into something close to a national asset. Park Works at Lockwood and the Penistone Foundry produced over 500,000 aero-engine gears, components for the Rolls-Royce Merlin and Bristol Hercules engines that powered Spitfires, Lancasters, Mosquitoes and Halifaxes. They manufactured more than 10,000 tank transmissions, including the Merritt-Brown-controlled differential steering system, first patented in 1935 with Henry Merritt, Director of Tank Design at Woolwich Arsenal. That steering unit went into the Churchill tank, the Centurion, the Conqueror, and the Tortoise. Penistone rolled armour plate for Churchill and Cromwell tanks and cast steel casings for blockbuster bombs. At Meltham, production of the VAK-1 tractor continued throughout the war. Over 7,700 built, many requisitioned for military and agricultural use. The works also turned out VIG aircraft tugs for the RAF, heavy-duty machines used to haul bomb trolleys across airfields. Lord Haw-Haw, William Joyce, broadcasting Nazi propaganda from Hamburg, twice announced on German radio that Meltham Mills had been destroyed by the Luftwaffe. It hadn't been touched. The works sat hidden in a deeply wooded valley beneath the moors, and wooden mock buildings had been erected on the open hillside above to draw any bombs away from the real factory. Joyce's broadcasts were, at best, wishful thinking. The workers heard about it and laughed. peace brought a different kind of urgency. British agriculture was mechanising at extraordinary speed, from roughly 1 tractor per 100 acres in 1939 to 1 per 50 by 1955. Government grants, a tractor-starved continental Europe, and the sheer momentum of wartime production capacity created an export bonanza. David Brown was uniquely placed. He had the gears, the foundries, the workforce, and the wartime profits, and he had Albert Kersey's team, who were already working on the next generation. The VAK-1C, known as the Cropmaster, arrived in 1947 and became the machine that built the empire. Almost 60,000 were produced in 7 years, second only to the 990 in total David Brown production. The Cropmaster was a revelation on British farms, reliable, well-geared, versatile, and, in its diesel variant from 1949, remarkably economical. David Brown had engaged the Ricardo engineering consultancy to specify a diesel-ready engine block, and the result was a unit so smooth that Tom Lazenby, a long-serving Brown sales executive, recalled Ford's UK sales manager Frankie Daniels approaching him at the Smithfield show. "It's marvellous. It runs just like a sewing machine. That's what we want, not an old slab-sided design like ours." The Cropmaster also had a feature that became part of Yorkshire folklore, a double seat designed for 2. The official explanation was operator comfort. The unofficial truth, acknowledged with a grin on every farm in the riding, was that it was where many young couples spent their first afternoons together in the early 1950s. The courting tractor, they called it. But David Brown's restlessness wasn't satisfied by tractors alone. On the 1st of October 1946, an advert appeared on the front page of the Times offering a high-class motor business for sale, asking £30,000. Brown inquired and discovered it was Aston Martin, a legendary name with no money, no factory worth speaking of, and a reputation built on pre-war racing glory. In February 1947, he bought it for £20,500, funded personally from his wartime windfall. Lagonda followed in 1948 for £52,500. Tickford coach builders came in 1955. The connection between Meltham and the sports car world was more than financial. Aston Martin engine design and early production work was based at Meltham. The tractor division's chief engineer, Bert Ashfield, oversaw both the farm machinery and the Aston Martin Lagonda manufacturing operations. When the DB2 went into production in 1950, components were being cast and machined in the same works by the same men who were building Cropmaster diesels 3 doors down. The DB5 that would appear in Goldfinger in 1964 was, mechanically, partly the work of a Yorkshire tractor town. By the late 1950s, the model range was expanding. The 900 series arrived in 1955, the 950 in 1958, the first David Browns to feature the Implematic hydraulic system. Then came the machine that defined the brand, the 990 Implematic, launched in 1961, a 52.5 brake horsepower, 4-cylinder direct injection diesel with a cross-flow head. Over 40,600 Implematics were sold by 1965. Across all 990 variants, more than 67,000 by 1980. It was, for a generation of British and Irish farmers, simply the tractor. You learned to drive on one at 12 years old, feet barely reaching the clutch. You ploughed your father's first 10 acres with one. You took the old man's coffin to the churchyard with the Orchard 990 hitched to the trailer. Robin Kedward, writing in the farming press, called it a power unit that would just laugh at rotor spreaders, whistlers and forage harvesters. In October 1965, the Selectomatic range arrived, the 770, 880 and 990, now featuring single-lever hydraulic services selection. David Brown was the first British manufacturer to offer it, and with the Selectomatic came a new livery. Hunting pink, the colour of Sir David's riding jacket, was retired after 26 years. In its place, orchid white tinwork over chocolate brown castings with poppy red wheels. The change was partly driven by American market preferences. A Boland's import deal and recruitment of ex-Ford dealers in the States demanded a livery that didn't clash with their showroom expectations. But the white and brown scheme became, for a generation, the look of a David Brown tractor. It was handsome, it was distinctive, and it was everywhere. By 1968, David Brown had 10 subsidiaries worldwide, 2,508 agents in 100 countries, and 80% of production leaving these islands for foreign fields. The Queen's Award to Industry for Export Achievement arrived that year. Sir David Brown, knighted the same year for services to industry, accepted it in person. Britain's third largest tractor manufacturer, behind only the mighty Ford and Massey Ferguson, was at the top of its game. The question nobody at Meltham thought to ask was what happened when a company built on gears and tractors tried to run a sports car empire on the side, and whether the bank financing all of it would keep its nerve. Chapter 4. Hunting Pink to Orchid White. If you'd walked through the gates at Meltham Mills on a Tuesday morning in 1969, the first thing you'd have noticed was the sound. Not one sound, a layered wall of them. The squeal of gear hobbers turning differential casings in the machine shop, the rhythmic thud of the press tools in the fabrication bay, the hiss and rush of the paint booth spraying orchid white over chocolate brown. Overhead, the clatter of the transfer conveyor carrying assemblies from one building to the next, and underneath it all, the steady bass note that a large factory generates simply by existing, the hum of ventilation, of compressed air, of electrical transformers, of a building designed for noise and filled to its purpose. The works spread across 78 acres at the bottom of the home valley. To the north, the Pennine Moors rose behind the chimney stacks. To the south, the village of Meltham climbed the opposite hillside. Stone terraces, a church spire, the co-op. The original buildings were H-block, converted from the United Thread Mill's weaving sheds, where Jonas Brooke and brothers had once spun silk. Their goat's head crest still adorned the old administrative offices. Alongside H-block stood the foundry, the trim shop, the field test department, and the engine assembly. Scarbottom Mill, a little closer to Lockwood, housed the drawing offices. And then, dominating the south side of the site, R-block, the new assembly line, opened in 1971, built over the old Meltham Mills football and cricket grounds opposite the toll bar. Insiders called it the most modern tractor plant in the world. The production workflow had a rhythm to it that hadn't changed in its essentials since the Cropmaster years. Castings arrived from the Penistone foundry. Machining and gear cutting happened at Parkworks in Lockwood. Engine assembly and the full tractor build took place at Meltham Mills. Finished machines were field tested on the disused railway track that ran along the valley floor. The old Meltham branch line closed to passengers in 1949. Then painted, inspected, and dispatched by road to Hull and Liverpool docks, where they went under tarpaulins onto cargo ships bound for 100 countries. The men and women who did this work weren't passing through. Multi-generational employment was the norm. One anonymous memoir, published years later on the David Brown Tractor Club's website, captures it plainly. My dad, mum, briefly, brother and uncle worked there for a while at Meltham Mills too. So did my girlfriend Margaret, now my wife. You didn't just work at Brown's. Your family worked at Brown's. Your neighbours worked at Brown's. The man you sat next to in the stands at Meltham Athletic on Saturday had stood next to you on the line all week. Children identified themselves by their father's department. Wages for skilled toolmakers and gear cutters ran to roughly £35 to £45 a week in 1971, about 1.5 times the West Yorkshire industrial average, high enough to buy a stone terrace house in the village within a decade, high enough to keep a family, run a car, put something away. The work supported not just the workforce, but the entire economy of the village around it. Tom Lazenby, the sales executive who'd watched the Cropmaster win admirers at Smithfield, had risen through the ranks from an apprenticeship. So had Jack Thompson, who became managing director during the Tenneco years. Eddie Herbert, in the field test department, solved a problem with boiling petrol on exported machines that UK management had told him was unsolvable. He cracked it on a trip to the American dealers, and the fix worked. Malcolm Clegg, in the drawing office at Scarbottom, would later rescue the 90 series bonnet design after a case stylist's attempt produced what Clegg's team called a crocodile snout, a profile so badly proportioned that Meltham's own engineers had to redesign it before production could start. The culture was paternalistic in the old Yorkshire sense. Sir David personally visited the shop floor. He invited senior men to Dirk Arood's, his house in the village, for the annual works party. The trade union, the AUEW, the Amalgamated Union of Engineering Workers, had a strong presence but was cooperative rather than militant through the 1960s. This wasn't Cowley or Longbridge. There were no wildcat strikes, no Fleet Street headlines about walkouts. The relationship between management and floor was, by the standards of British manufacturing, remarkably stable. What the workers built, they were proud of. A David Brown tractor was famed for two things above all: its gearbox, no surprise from the world's foremost gear maker, and its cast-iron chassis. Every other major British tractor was built as a stressed member, boltless construction. David Brown's was the only one built on a solid cast-iron frame. Workers spoke of building a proper tractor, not a bolted-up box. Cropmaster owners routinely got 6 decades of service from one engine. The 990 became a cult. Even now, at restored auctions, prices range from £850 to £5,600. People didn't scrap David Brown's. They kept them. They named them. They passed them down. And at the peak of a shift, with R-block running at full capacity, the paint shops spraying, the field test machines growling up the old railway track, the dispatch bay loading for Hull docks, the Meltham Works was building roughly one tractor every 6 minutes. Chapter 5. A village built of tractors. Meltham's name betrays its deep past. Old English. Meltham, the smelter's village. Iron and industry weren't new here, but by the mid-20th century, the village had become something more unusual, a place where a single employer defined not just the economy, but the daily texture of life. The 7:30 siren started the day. 2 shifts. The men streamed down Knoll Lane and Meltham Mills Road in the morning, and back up again at clock-off. A daily tide of boiler suits, lunchboxes, and flat caps that emptied the terraced streets below and filled them again by tea time. Wages were spent in the village butcher, the baker, the cooperative society, founded in 1827, one of the oldest in England, originally brook-backed from the Threadmill dynasty whose buildings the tractor works now occupied. The institutions of the village were layered on top of each other like geological strata, each era leaving its mark. The bank buildings, Tudor Gothic workers' housing erected by the Brooke family in 1860, still lined the main street. The Carlisle Institute served as post office, library, and council office. The subscription school had become a restaurant. The Gothic 1898 town hall would, decades later, become the rallying point of the Save Case Tractors campaign. St. James's Church, built by the Brooke family as the Works Church, still held its congregation of tractor men and their families through the 1950s and 60s. And then there was the band. The Meltham and Meltham Mills Band, founded in 1846, had achieved something in the late Victorian era that placed this small Pennine village in the national record books. Under conductor John Gladney, the band became the first in history to win the British Open 3 consecutive years: 1876, 1877 and 1878. That feat, according to Brass Bands England, has been matched by only 6 other bands in 170 years of competition. The band was founded by the Brooke family. It was sustained informally by David Brown workers' subscriptions well into the 1980s. The sound of brass rehearsals drifting from the band room on a Thursday evening was as much a part of Meltham's acoustic landscape as the factory hum. Saturday was for Meltham Athletic, football on the pitch that the R-block extension would later consume. Sunday was for Meltham Cricket Club, multiple Sykes Cup winners. In between, there were the pleasure grounds, the park laid out by the Brookes for their workers' recreation, and the pubs where a man could drink with the same blokes he'd stood alongside on the line since his apprenticeship. The works didn't just employ the village, it connected it to the world. David Brown had 10 subsidiaries: Northern Ireland, Ire, Australia, Canada, the United States, South Africa, West Germany, France, Denmark, Sweden, and Finland. 2,508 agents in 100 countries sold machines built in this valley. At peak, 80% of Meltham's output was exported. By 1971, that figure had climbed to 90%. A village of 7,500 people was sending tractors to every continent except Antarctica. Some of those export orders carried a peculiar charm. Aer Lingus bought an entire batch of bright green David Browns for ramp work at Dublin Airport, the airline's livery matched, to the delight of the paint shop. The United States Air Force ordered a number of 1390s in drab military green, but a small quantity arrived in pink. The reasoning, so the story goes, was desert reconnaissance towing, echoing the logic behind the famously pink-painted Spitfires of the Second World War. Nobody at Meltham had ever seen a pink tractor leave the line before. In 1977, the 500,000th David Brown tractor rolled off the Meltham assembly line. It was the Queen's Silver Jubilee year, and the machine was presented with appropriate ceremony. A milestone tractor from a works that held the royal warrant. It was auctioned for charity, passed through private hands, and surfaced, decades later, in 2022, at Runnymede, as Elizabeth II's funeral cortege passed. A fragment of post-imperial Britain, built in a Pennine Valley, marking the end of the second Elizabethan age on the meadow where Magna Carta was sealed. By the early 1970s, David Brown of Meltham was a name that meant something specific on British farms. Not the biggest, not the cheapest, but the best geared, the best built, the most reliable tractor a small to medium farm could own. Briefly, in 1979, the 90 series, 1190, 1290, 1390, 1490, 1690, outsold both Ford and Massey Ferguson in the United Kingdom. Heavy discounting helped, but so did reputation, earned over 4 decades and 40,000 shop floor hours in a factory that never once made the front page for a strike. Chapter 6. Apex. The high watermark, if you had to choose a single year, was 1971. That spring, Sir David Brown personally cut the ribbon on R Block, the new assembly line that had cost a fortune and consumed the old football and cricket grounds. The production line inside was state-of-the-art. The Synchromesh 12+4 gearbox was now standard. The HydraShift semi-automatic powershift transmission, fitted to the 1210 and 1212, had won a Design Council Award, the first ever given to a farm tractor. The workforce stood at close to 4,000. Exports ran at 90% of output. The second Queen's Award to industry for export achievement arrived that year, following the first in 1968. It looked like triumph. Sir David was 67, knighted, honoured, commanding an industrial group that spanned gears, tractors, sports cars, coach builders and shipbuilders. Vosper Thornycroft, the warship makers, acquired in 1963 and merged in 1966, sat alongside Aston Martin Lagonda and the tractor works in a portfolio that would have made any Yorkshire industrialist proud. But there was something rotten underneath the ceremony, and the name of it was debt. Aston Martin was hemorrhaging cash. It had been hemorrhaging cash for years. Sir David was widely understood, inside the firm and beyond it, to be using tractor and gear profits to keep Newport Pagnell alive. The DBS V8, launched in 1970, was selling, but development costs were brutal. The sports car operation existed because David Brown loved it, not because it made commercial sense, and it was draining the lifeblood of the business that actually made money. R Block, the cathedral of modern tractor manufacturing, had been financed almost entirely on a £30 million overdraft with Lloyds Bank. That was the entirety of the group's credit line. One bank, one facility, one relationship. On the 4th of February 1971, Rolls-Royce voluntarily entered receivership. The RB211 jet engine program had consumed the company. Lloyds Bank, exposed to Rolls-Royce, exposed to David Brown, exposed to engineering debt across the board, reassessed every major industrial loan on its books. And the phone call came to Meltham. Tom Lazenby remembered it clearly. At the time, our overdraft with them was around £30 million, and they called it in on demand. Sir David negotiated a way out for the short term, but it was obvious that something had to go. The R Block that Sir David had just opened, the most modern tractor plant in the world, the crowning investment of his career, was the thing that had broken the finances. The factory that crowned the empire had bankrupted the empire, and the man who had cycled 6 miles to work every morning at 17, who had built a global tractor brand from a silk mill in a valley, who had given his initials to the most famous sports car in cinema, that man was about to lose everything he'd built. Sir David Brown had 18 months left in command. Chapter 7. Seeds. The board moved first. In 1971, before Lloyds had even finished calling in the overdraft, the directors of the David Brown Corporation removed Sir David from executive control. He remained chairman in name, but the levers were gone. The man who had run the business since he was 27, who had answered Harry Ferguson's inquiry, who had thrown his hunting jacket across a prototype, who had bought Aston Martin on a whim and built a tractor empire from a thread mill, was out. He didn't go quietly. He went bitterly. The Aston Martin problem had to be solved first. After personally clearing approximately £5 million of Aston Martin Lagonda's debts, Sir David sold the sports car company in February 1972 for a nominal £101 to Company Developments Limited, a Birmingham-based investment consortium chaired by an accountant named William Wilson. £101 for the mark that bore his initials. The new owners immediately dropped the DB designation. The DBS became simply the V8. The badge wouldn't return for 21 years. Then came the tractors. On the 8th of July 1972, the New York Times reported the deal. Buyer, Tenneco Incorporated of Houston, Texas, a diversified conglomerate whose interests spanned oil, gas, packaging, and automotive parts. Tenneco had become majority owner of J.I. Case in 1967 through its acquisition of Kern County Land Company and full owner by 1970. The price for David Brown tractors, more than $33 million. In Yorkshire, the transaction was presented as something gentler than a sale. The spring 1973 issue of Tractor News, the in-house journal, announced that David Brown tractors would be affiliated with J.I. Case. Affiliated. The word did a lot of work. It suggested partnership, shared endeavour, mutual benefit. It did not suggest what was actually happening, that a Houston oil and gas conglomerate had bought a Yorkshire tractor works and would henceforth make every significant decision about its future from an office in Racine, Wisconsin. There was an accidental irony in that issue of Tractor News that the workforce noticed immediately. Above the merger announcement ran a headline by the in-house journalist Alan Earnshaw, "End of the line." The article was about the dismantling of the old Meltham branch railway, but workers reading only the banner, as people do with newspapers, thought it was about them. The headline sat there on the same page as the word affiliated and said something that nobody in management intended it to say. Tom Lazenby, who understood the finances better than most, was blunt about the cause. The banks. Sir David negotiated a way out for the short term, but it was obvious that something had to go. Jack Thompson, the managing director who would lead the works through the Tenneco years, had seen it coming from a different angle. We had long known that to justify our new plant, a merger with another manufacturer was essential. The R-block investment demanded volume that David Brown alone couldn't generate. The merger was supposed to deliver it. Sir David himself believed he'd been betrayed, not by Tenneco but by the British establishment. He'd personally lobbied Prime Minister Harold Wilson, another Huddersfield man, for a government-brokered merger between David Brown and Nuffield, the tractor arm of British Leyland. It went nowhere. There were rumours, never independently verified, that a small number of Brown Nuffield tractors had been secretly assembled in an aircraft hangar in Burscough, Lancashire, in advance of a deal that political will ultimately killed. Whether the hangar story is true or not, the political failure was real. Britain's government declined to consolidate its tractor industry. Tenneco did not decline to buy it. Sir David sold Vosper Thornycroft, his beloved warship builders, to the government in 1977, when Callaghan's Labour administration nationalised the yard. Bitter about the nationalisation, bitter about the banks, bitter about the Aston Martin debts that had bled his tractor business dry, he left Britain permanently for Monte Carlo. He was 73 years old. He would not return. Meanwhile, the world outside Meltham was shifting in ways that made a Yorkshire tractor works progressively harder to sustain. The 1973 oil crisis quadrupled diesel prices. UK farm incomes collapsed. Britain's accession to the European Economic Community the same year brought the Common Agricultural Policy, which reshaped purchasing patterns. Farms grew larger, but bought fewer, bigger tractors, squeezing the small to medium segment where David Brown had always been strongest. The Health and Safety at Work Act of 1974 mandated safety cabs on all new tractors, the Q-cab regulation, effective from 1977, and each model required expensive recertification. Japanese manufacturers, Sato, Kubota, were pushing into the small tractor market with machines that undercut British prices. East European imports from Czechoslovakia and Romania, Zetor, UTB, were doing the same at the mid-range. By 1984, according to figures Barry Shearman MP cited in Hansard, foreign imports had captured 78% of the UK tractor market. Bert Ashfield, the chief engineer who'd overseen both Cropmasters and Aston Martins, saw the competitive picture with a veteran's clarity. Ferguson came in with real mass production with Massey Ferguson, and later on Ford got going as well. So we began to feel the draft a bit. The draft was about to become a gale. Chapter 8. The Erasure. The time and motion men arrived within months of the Tenneco deal closing. They flooded various departments, clipboards in hand, measuring things that had never been measured at Meltham: cycle times, material flows, staffing ratios. Upsetting a fair few workers, as the in-house record put it. The older hands recognized what was happening. This wasn't partnership. This wasn't affiliation. This was an American corporation, learning which parts of its new acquisition it intended to keep. The first visible change was the livery. In 1973, the beloved orchid white and chocolate brown scheme was altered. The brown castings were repainted in power red, a colour that happened to align with Case's own desert sunset. The David Brown name remained on the bonnet, but alongside it now sat the Case badge, and the rose insignia, the Yorkshire and Lancashire roses adopted when Brown acquired Harrison, McGregor and Guest of Lee in 1955, shrank year by year. The DB emblem, a Greek delta D that the workforce had nicknamed the bottle opener, was introduced as a transitional device. It looked like a brand mark. It functioned as a dimmer switch. In 1976 came the Quiet Cab, a genuine engineering improvement, one of the best enclosed tractor cabs on the market. It won praise from farmers and the trade press. It also served, whether intentionally or not, as a distraction. While Meltham's engineers were solving real problems for real customers, the corporate architecture above them was being quietly restructured. Research and development for new models was progressively concentrated at Case's headquarters in Racine, Wisconsin. The Scarbottom Drawing Office, briefly designated the main design and development area for the European tractor range, was being defunded in increments too small to trigger alarm, too steady to ignore. Apprentice intakes were cut from the late 1970s onward. One former apprentice-trained engineer, writing anonymously years later, recorded the slow bleed with the flat affect of someone who'd lived through it. Many apprentice-trained engineers had lost their jobs, including myself. In 1979, the 90 series was launched at a dealer event in Monaco, a location that told you everything about where the money was now being spent and where it wasn't. The new bonnets had been styled by a Case designer in Racine. Malcolm Clegg's team at Scarbottom took one look and knew they had a problem. The crocodile snout profile was, in Clegg's assessment, woefully inadequate, visually wrong and aerodynamically poor. His team redesigned it before the tractor could go into production. Meltham was still fixing Racine's mistakes, but Meltham was no longer being asked whether the mistakes should be made in the first place. Then came 1983, and the moment that older farmers still talk about with something close to grief. The David Brown name was dropped entirely from the tractor range. The 94 series, the 1194, 1294, 1394, 1494, 1594, 1694 carried only Case decals on the bonnet. The sole trace of David Brown's name on the machine was cast into the engine block itself, visible only when you lifted the bonnet and looked down. A name that had adorned British tractors since 1939 now existed only in iron, hidden from view. The effect on brand loyalty was devastating. Older British and Irish farmers had bought David Brown tractors because they trusted the name, trusted the gears, trusted the chassis, trusted the village where they were made. Dealer surveys by the mid-1980s showed that UK farmers now viewed Case as an American company with no Yorkshire credibility. The deep affection for the orchid white livery, for the bottle opener badge, for the idea of a British-built tractor from a works you could visit. That affection hadn't transferred. It had simply died, and then Tenneco did something that sealed Meltham's fate. On the 26th of November 1984, Tenneco announced the purchase of most of International Harvester's farm equipment operations. The price, $430 million, $260 million in cash and $170 million in preference stock. The deal merged IH's global agricultural machinery with J.I. Case, creating a company second in size only to John Deere. It was, by the standards of the farm equipment industry, an earthquake. By March 1985, Tenneco had exercised its option on IH's European subsidiaries, plants in France, Germany, and Denmark. In Britain, the acquisition brought two former IH factories into the Case fold: Wheatley Hall Road, Doncaster, which was operational, and Car Hill, Doncaster, which had been mothballed since 1983. Both sat on the M18-M1 corridor, directly connected to the national motorway network. Suddenly, Tenneco owned two British tractor manufacturing facilities 35 miles apart. One was at Meltham, Upper Pennine Valley at the end of a branch railway line that had been closed since 1949, with no motorway access and a road network designed for horse-drawn carts. The other was at Doncaster, flat, accessible, motorway adjacent, freshly acquired, and needing investment to justify its purchase price. Jack Thompson had seen the logic before anyone in Racine spelled it out. When someone in America looked at a map, they would think that the IH plant at Doncaster was almost next door to Meltham. It wasn't, of course. 35 miles of Pennine Road separated them, but on a map in Wisconsin, the two dots were practically touching, and one of them was surplus. The writing appeared on the wall in the summer of 1985. By November, 310 more jobs were cut at Meltham. On the 4th of November, a public meeting was held at Meltham Town Hall, the Gothic 1898 building that had once been the seat of civic confidence. The Save Case Tractors campaign was launched. On the 8th of November, shop stewards presented a petition to Councillor Colin Walker, Mayor of Kirklees. On the 14th of November, Kirklees Metropolitan Council formally took up the campaign, warning that Meltham faced a 19% unemployment rate, £200,000 in lost rates income, and a further 900 supplier jobs at risk. Richard Seagrave, Case's European manufacturing chief, issued the standard reassurance in late 1985. Case plants in Meltham and Lee will continue to be an important source for agricultural tractor and construction equipment manufacture. It was the kind of sentence that means nothing and is designed to mean nothing. It promised continuation without promising anything specific. It was a holding statement dressed as a commitment. In January 1986, 460 more jobs went, the fourth round of cuts in 14 months. Meltham's headcount dropped to 1,150, from nearly 4,000 a decade earlier. Barry Shearman, the Labour MP for Huddersfield, broke his patience publicly. For a long time we have been pussyfooting around, all of us being very polite in our expressions to the government and to the company. But we do not seem to be getting anywhere, and worse still, we appear to be being desperately starved of information. Mr. Seagrave was not available for comment. The political battle that followed was fierce and, ultimately, futile. On the 8th of February 1986, the Daily Examiner ran a startling headline: Thatcher stopped case closure plan. Conservative councillor John Holt announced that the Prime Minister had personally intervened following a meeting at Number 10. Case Tractors would have been closed last year if it had not been for the Prime Minister's intervention. Holt added that he'd made it clear to Seagrave that further job cuts were unacceptable. Whether Thatcher actually saved the works for a year, or whether Holt was claiming credit for a decision Tenneco had already made, remains a matter of local political dispute. What isn't disputed is what happened next, or rather, what didn't. Barry Shearman's planned meeting with the industry minister was cancelled because of the Westland helicopter crisis. Neil Kinnock, the Labour leader, visited Meltham Mills in March 1986. An all-party Kirklees delegation met the minister. Sympathetic, but could offer no help in the battle for jobs. The government acknowledged the significance of the Meltham plant and suggested it might qualify for some project support under the Industry Act. No support arrived. Meanwhile, across the Channel, the French government was pouring $63 million into Case's French plants at Saint-Dizier and Croix. The European Commission pursued France over the legality of the subsidies. Britain, which could have fought for equivalent support for Meltham, did not. The contrast was noted at the time. It has not been forgotten since. On the 31st of October 1986, the Daily Examiner reported what amounted to the death warrant. Case announced a £90 million investment programme for Doncaster, including the transfer of 2 tractor models from Racine, Wisconsin, a 116 horsepower and 138 horsepower machine. 2,000 new jobs were promised at Doncaster in the early 1990s. Shearman accused the US-based giant of deliberately stoking speculation and uncertainties about Meltham's future. The speculation ended in January 1987. Case announced that full tractor production at Meltham would cease. 700 jobs would go. The works would be reduced to a component facility with a future workforce of 500. By July, the forecast had worsened. 850 jobs to go, and the Lee plant in Lancashire, with its 333 employees, was also threatened with closure by the end of the year. In August 1987, the AUEW formally accepted the closure. The phrase they used was a sad and disappointing blow. John Harmon, the Kirklees Council leader, called it a terrible blow for the community. A salvage team was assembled to assist the 700 workers facing redundancy. There is one detail from the Tenneco years that cuts through all the corporate language and all the political manoeuvring and says everything about what Meltham actually was, even in its final years. The 1394, produced at Meltham, bearing case decals on a David Brown body, was, at the time of the closure announcement, the top-selling tractor in the entire Case International range. The most productive line in the company was the one they chose to close. Chapter 9. 11 March, Autumn 1987. The redundancy notices were being prepared. 700 slips of paper, each one a family's income, a mortgage, a set of school fees, a Friday night at the pub. On the 11th of December, 400 notices were issued. The same day, the Daily Examiner carried a small advertisement from a firm of consulting engineers seeking experienced tractor staff, contracted to Trantor Tractors of India. The men who had just been told they were losing their jobs could read in the same newspaper an invitation to apply for work-building tractors for an Indian company. The irony was not subtle. It was not intended. It was simply the way the world now worked. January and February, 1988. The factory wound down in stages. Men collected personal effects from lockers. Tools that had sat in the same drawer for 30 years were wrapped in cloth and carried home. The canteen still served tea, but the queues were shorter every week. The 4th of March. 150 men and women finished for the last time. Handshakes at the gate. No ceremony. No speeches. The 11th of March, 1988, the last morning at Meltham Mills. The final tractor was a David Brown 1594, 95 horsepower, 6-cylinder turbocharged diesel, two-wheel drive, US specification, serial number 154 BJB 1528785. It was painted Case International red and black, not hunting pink, not orchid white, not the chocolate and poppy scheme that farmers would have recognized. It carried a commemorative edition badge on the bonnet. Commemorative. The word choice was exquisite in its corporate emptiness. You commemorate an anniversary. You commemorate a victory. You do not commemorate a closure unless you are the people who ordered it and need a word that sounds like respect. The tractor rolled off the line. A few photographs were taken. Long-serving men shook hands. There was no champagne. Local press reports described the moment as quiet, almost ceremonial. The subdued dignity of people who understood that anger wouldn't change anything, and that this was the last time they'd stand together in this building. It was the 50th anniversary year of David Brown tractor production, 1938 to 1988. 50 years. The commemoration was the wake. Barry Shearman, the MP who had fought the closure for 3 years, spoke to the press. "This is a very tragic day for Huddersfield and for the Colne Valley. It is a day that should not have come to pass." Councillor Robert Ashton, a justice of the peace and a lifelong Browns worker, was more direct. "I feel bitter that for years people in authority or in government have seen what may happen, but have buried their heads in the sand and pretended the problem had gone. I felt when Case took over, it was the beginning of the end. They wanted the outlets and the expertise that Browns had created." The 1594 was loaded and shipped immediately to the Case Heritage Facility in Racine, Wisconsin. It sat outdoors there for 15 years, preserved largely by the dry Midwestern climate, its 20 hours of factory test running the only work it ever did. The last tractor built at Meltham spent its first decade and a half in an American car park, 3,000 miles from the valley where it was made. 7 months later, in October 1988, the auctioneers came. Norman Levy and Associates of London conducted a 2-day sale. 2,500 separate lots, over 800 machine tools, 50 milling machines among them, gear hobbers, lathes, presses, jigs, the transfer conveyors that had carried assemblies from building to building for decades. Everything that couldn't be unbolted was cut free. Everything that could be sold was sold. The most modern tractor plant in Britain, R Block, opened with ceremony in 1971, 17 years old, was reduced to scrap metal value in a weekend. In 1989, Fred Lawton and Son Limited moved into R Block. They spun carpet yarn. The building that had assembled David Brown tractors for 17 years returned to textiles. Meltham Mills had come full circle, from Jonas Brooks' thread mill to David Brown's tractor works, and back to spinning fibre in exactly 50 years. Chapter 10. The Goat's Head Remains. The dispersal of the Meltham workforce was not dramatic. It was quiet and various, and in many cases, permanent. One anonymous former apprentice-trained engineer, writing on the David Brown Tractor Club website years later, catalogued what happened to his colleagues with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had long since made peace with it. Some still in different branches of the engineering industry, some in totally unrelated trades, from hat makers to booksellers and insurance agents. Some have now retired, and I myself am happily sweeping chimneys. That single passage, a qualified tractor engineer, trained at Meltham, ending his working life sweeping chimneys, says more about the aftermath of British deindustrialisation than any parliamentary speech or policy document could manage. 700 final redundancies, as many as 2,700 jobs lost across the wider supplier base, according to Kirklees Council's pre-closure estimate. Unemployment in Meltham climbed toward 19%. Coopers and Lybrand were commissioned by the council to draw up a report on the future use of the site. Limited grant support trickled through under the Industry Act. It wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. Meltham didn't die. That's the thing about these places. They rarely do. What Meltham did was something subtler and, in its way, sadder. It became a dormitory. By the 2000s, the village had reinvented itself as a commuter settlement for Manchester, Leeds and Huddersfield, accredited as a Walkers Are Welcome town in 2013, a gateway to the Peak District, marketed on the beauty of the landscape, rather than the industry that once filled it. Population barely changed, around 8,500 by 2021. But the composition shifted entirely. The men who streamed down Knoll Lane at 7:30 were replaced by cars heading for the M62. The works canteen became a memory. The 7:30 siren fell silent and was never heard again. The 78-acre Meltham Mills site survived demolition. Towndoor Limited acquired it in 1988 and progressively converted it into the Meltham Mills Industrial Estate. Small units, 300 to 35,000 square feet, light industry, warehousing, the miscellaneous trades that fill the carcasses of dead factories across Britain. R Block housed Fred Lawton's carpet yarn operation, succeeded by Lawton Yarns, succeeded in turn by Chimera, a contract upholstery fabrics company that has, in an irony the Brooke family would have appreciated, returned textile production to a building that began as a thread mill in the 1850s and spent only 50 years of its existence doing anything else. Lou's Place Cafe opened on site in 2022. You can get a bacon sandwich where gear hobbers once turned differential casings. An indoor go-kart track briefly occupied part of the site. It closed. Durka Roods, Sir David Brown's own house in the village, where he'd hosted the annual works party, where senior men had drunk his whiskey and felt the warmth of a paternalism that wasn't entirely pretense, became a hotel after his departure. It closed in 2021. In 2026 it sits empty, falling into disrepair. The gardens where tractor men once gathered are overgrown. But not everything was lost. Not quite. The David Brown Gear Company, the original business, the pattern maker's grandson's inheritance, the park works at Lockwood, where it all began in 1860, survived. Tenneco had wanted the tractors, not the gears, and the gear side passed through a succession of owners. Textron in 1998, Clyde Blowers in 2008, a merger with Finnish company Santasalo in 2016 to form David Brown Santasalo, now owned by N4 Partners. In 2026, 166 years after the 17-year-old David Brown set up his pattern-making shop in Thomas Broadbent's stable, the firm still manufactures transmissions at Lockwood. Among its products, the gearboxes for Challenger 2 tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles, and the mechanism that rotates the restaurant at the top of the BT Tower in London. Every day, quietly, the name David Brown still turns above the capital's skyline. Sir David himself lived long enough to see one last thing. In 1993, Walter Hayes, then chairman of Aston Martin under Ford's ownership, sought out the 88-year-old in Monte Carlo and asked his permission to revive the DB designation for a new model. Sir David agreed. The DB7 was unveiled at the Geneva Motor Show in March 1993, 21 years after the letters had been stripped from the marque. Sir David was made honorary life president of Aston Martin Lagonda. On the 3rd of September 1993, David Brown died in Monte Carlo. He was 89. He had lived 6 months past the revival of his initials on a sports car. He did not live to see how thoroughly his name had been erased from the tractor world. Around 2003, a David Brown Tractor Club member named Robert Webster was on holiday in the United States. He visited the Case IH Heritage Facility in Racine, Wisconsin, and found the last Meltham tractor, the 1594, serial number 154 BJB 155287885, still sitting where it had been parked 15 years earlier. He approached Case IH. They donated it back to the club. It was shipped across the Atlantic, lightly refurbished, only 20 hours on the clock, and brought home to Meltham. In February 2022, the David Brown Tractor Club Museum opened at Unit J2, Gate 4, Meltham Mills Industrial Estate, Knoll Lane, Meltham, HD9 4DS. The address is inside the former H Block, the converted weaving shed where the first VAK-1 rolled off the line in 1939. Roughly 20 tractors sit on display. The last 1594 is the centerpiece. Open the last weekend of every month, 10 till 3. Free entry. Secretary, Roger Brereton. The volunteers keep the lights on with subscriptions and donations, and the quiet, stubborn devotion of people who will not let the story disappear. Chapter 11. What remains? Stand at the gate on Knoll Lane in May 2026 and look in. The moor still rises behind the buildings, just as it did when Harold Hawks and Harry Lockley sprayed the first hunting pink bonnet in 1939. The valley floor is the same. The stream, the trees, the old railway line that once carried finished tractors to Hull docks and now serves as the museum's annual road run route. The Goat's Head crest of Jonas Brook still marks the old office building. The stone walls haven't moved. Everything else has. The American conglomerate that killed Meltham didn't prosper from the killing. Tenneco divested Case in stages through the 1990s. Case merged with New Holland in 1999 to form CNH Global. CNH became part of Fiat Industrial, then CNH Industrial, then split into Iveco Group and CNH Industrial again. The corporate genealogy is a nesting doll of mergers, each one further from the thing that started it all. And the Doncaster plant, the international harvester facility whose acquisition sealed Meltham's fate, was itself closed in 2007 when Argo Tractors bought the McCormick brand and moved production to Italy. Doncaster outlived Meltham by 19 years. Then it died too. The David Brown name survives in 2 places. One is the gearbox factory at Lockwood, where David Brown Santasalo still cuts gears 166 years after the first David Brown set up a lathe. The other is on the boot of every Aston Martin built since 1993, the DB12 in 2026, carrying those 2 letters at 170 miles an hour, bearing the initials of a man who made his money in tractors and his reputation in a valley that most Aston Martin owners will never visit and have likely never heard of. In the museum at Unit J2, Roger Brereton walks past the 1594 on a Saturday morning and pauses. The bonnet is open. The cast-iron engine block is visible, and there in the metal, raised letters that no corporate rebranding exercise could remove. David Brown. Cast into the iron. Part of the structure. You can paint over a name on a bonnet in an afternoon. You cannot erase a name that was cast into the block when the metal was poured. The name's still there, if you know where to look. Somewhere in the home valley, in a stone barn behind a farmhouse, on a lane that hasn't changed since the 1950s, a cropmaster in hunting pink coughs to life on a Sunday morning. 65 years since it left the works. The gearbox is smooth. The chassis is solid. The engine runs like a sewing machine. It pulls out into the lane, past dry stone walls and sheep, and climbs the hill toward the moor. In a Yorkshire village called Meltham, you can still hear the works in the silence, if you stand long enough at the gate.